Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing on with our video on the Uncanny X-Men, the Phoenix Saga, this is when things get interesting when it comes to Chris Claremont writing, because what he does, and this is kind of something that I want to sort of hit on here, is Chris Claremont will tell you a story and like a whole bunch of things will happen in that story, but only one of the things that happen in that story will matter when it comes to the story arc that takes place like 20 issues down the line. And that's really the way his run worked when it came to like the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas. And the reason why I say that is because in the earlier issues, there were a couple characters, a couple concepts who were introduced. The first was the Starjammers, which debuted in Uncanny X-Men number 97. And we'll talk about that here in a little while. And the next was Erik the Red, Devon Shikari. Now, Erik the Red was actually a concept that was used by Cyclops in the earlier stories of the X-Men before Chris Claremont took over. And so like we'll kind of explain how that works with regards to Devon Shikari here in a second. But what this does is it picks up immediately in the aftermath of basically like the Phoenix, like the prelude to the Phoenix Saga, right? So if you want to get caught up, feel free to watch that video. But essentially like Jean Grey is now bonded with the Phoenix Force and the space shuttles crashed into Jamaica Bay. And when it landed down here, the big question everybody had is what's going on with Jean? Because all she did was just suddenly manifest from the water and simply just shout, you know, like I'm life incarnate, I am Phoenix. Her whole costume was changed, the whole 9 yards. And then shortly after that, literally like her mind was overwhelmed by what she was experiencing. And then she essentially collapsed. Now, between the panels and what Chris Claremont doesn't really tell us and what he kind of relies on us to understand is that what Jean Grey is in possession of is an astronomical amount of power. That's one of the things that we've talked about when it comes to the Phoenix Force, that there's only one Phoenix Force in the whole multiverse. And in this instance, the Phoenix Force in its totality has bonded itself to Jean Grey because the idea was that Jean Grey was the perfect host for the Phoenix. And so almost immediately after she collapses, the question the X-Men begin to have is what's going on with her? Is she affected by the radiation that basically sent the space shuttle crashing down into Earth in the first place? They don't really know what to make of all this because remember, they were basically unconscious and held in stasis pods when the whole merger between the Phoenix and Jean took place, you know, when that originally happened. So they don't know any of that stuff that's going on. So of course, basically, it's Charles Xavier and the X-Men being whisked away, traveling out to visit Moira McTaggart, and then to in turn, like, you know, figure out what's going on Muir Island. Now, Moira McTaggart is a character who'd been around the X-Men for quite some time, and a little bit of explanation is needed here. She's been around the X-Men for quite some time, but Moira McTaggart is more of a mutant geneticist. Really, her and Xavier kind of work hand in hand, and in fact, she would play a pivotal role in essentially like leading into the formation of the New Mutants. But the way this worked, and even with X-Men Deadly Genesis, a story that came decades later, but really sort of gave her a much bigger role in the life of Xavier, is that where the two were kind of lovers at one point, the idea here was that, for the most part, if Xavier couldn't understand how a mutant's powers worked, then he would hand them over to Moira McTaggart. She would analyze them, figure out how their power worked, and then give them back to Xavier so he could train them adequately. Now, of course, basically you have like, you know, Dr. Corbeau who comes out and says, hey, look, everything's gonna be cool. She's not dead. She's currently just kind of healing from whatever it was that she went through, but she'll make a full recovery. And that's when things really kind of begin to pick up and really start moving into the Phoenix Saga proper. But again, what this does is it leads into an interesting scenario because for the most part, the X-Men get into a couple different fights. They get into a fight with Juggernaut and Black Tom Cassidy, and they get into a fight with Firelord. But for the most part, we didn't exactly know why. What ends up getting explained between issues 102 through 104, which we're really not going to go super in-depth into, is essentially that Erik the Red had been pitting like Magneto and Juggernaut and Black Tom Cassidy and Firelord all against the X-Men for the purposes of killing them, and the X-Men defeated them all quite readily. Now, for the character of Firelord, this is kind of important, and I want to have this conversation for a second. So Firelord is a guy by the name of Pirius Krill. He's basically a Xandarian. The race that formed the Nova Corps is essentially where he's from. Now, the idea here was that somewhere along the line where he was basically on like an explorer ship, essentially. His friend was kidnapped by Galactus. Eventually, Pirius caught up with him, only to find out his friend was turned into a herald and then died. And so Firelord became the new herald in his place. So eventually what ends up happening is that Firelord basically travels to Earth. And then in the process, in Thor issues 226 through 228, I'm pretty sure it was a 3-issue story arc, Thor hands the destroyer armor over to Galactus. And in turn, Firelord gets his freedom. But the result is that much like trying to duplicate the success of the Silver Surfer, the Firelord stays on Earth. This is part of the point where the Firelord is sitting on Earth, like where he's literally just kind of here exploring the world and all that kind of stuff, you know, different things like that, and kind of like understanding how humanity works and things along those lines. The issue here is that Firelord had simply just been duped by Erik the Red. That's really all it was. The Devon Shikari had gone to Firelord and say, hey, like there's this group called the X-Men and they're led by a guy named Xavier and he wants to like take over the world and like enslave everybody, so like you should go and fight them. And Firelord, essentially being a hero, was like, yes. So like he races off and he's been fighting the X-Men the whole whole time, and that's really kind of where the battle between the two of them comes from. Now, one of the big things where things really kind of begin to pick up here is what's really going on in the background, is that while the X-Men are kind of distracted by Juggernaut, or at least they were distracted by Juggernaut and Black Tom before they were defeated, where they were distracted by Firelord and distracted by Magneto, this allows Erik the Red to make his move. But one big thing that came out of this, and this is actually a pretty significant scenario, one big thing that came out of this was that prior to this story arc, Magneto had essentially been de-aged into a child. And the reason why this mattered is because it was kind of a way for Marvel to essentially sort of reboot Magneto, kind of a soft reboot for his character. And then ultimately what ended up happening is that when Erik the Red showed up on Earth, or I guess when he went to go grab Magneto, he'd been here for a while, but when he grabbed Magneto, he re-aged him back up to where basically an age equivalent to like Xavier and all them. And that's why when you go read Marvel Comics now, Magneto, despite having been alive during World War II, is not like 90 years old right now. At the same time that all this goes on, we really kind of get this other half of the equation, which is a character named Lilandra. Now, we didn't really know anything about her. Again, some of this stuff, the idea of Lilandra takes place before the Phoenix Saga. But with Lilandra kind of popping up, there were a few things that happened with Xavier, whether he was fighting a different race, the Xenox, whatever the case was, his telepathic powers were in a way growing. And because of the fact that there was kind of a connection that was being forged between himself and Lilandra, she was literally like desperate to get away from her world, or she was kind of escaping on this sort of scout ship. Ultimately, she reached out to Xavier. Xavier picked up on her, but didn't quite know how to handle the situation and didn't really know who she was. And so it's not really until this moment in the Phoenix Saga when she boards the teleportation device on her scout ship and teleports directly in front of Xavier, as well as Jean Grey and a couple other people, that she basically reveals who it is that she is, like what her story is, or at least to some degree what she's about. Now, around the time that this happens, where Xavier's kind of understand what's going on and so on and so forth, then you suddenly got Firelord attacking, and then you've got Jean Grey manifesting the Phoenix Force, and then Firelord basically kind of like the two of them start, squaring off against each other. Now, this was kind of Claremont basically saying, like, here's the kind of power Jean possesses now. And that's the significance of the Phoenix Saga. The significance of the Phoenix Saga was kind of building the concepts up, building things up and saying, here's the power Jean has, here's what she's capable of right now, and then like her power's only ever going to grow. And so for the most part, she's able to hold her own and in fact actually topple Firelord to a degree, but this allows Erik the Red to make his move. And what he basically does here is he kind of reveals his assignment as being an agent that was tasked to Earth by a guy named Dekin, an emperor of the Shi'ar Empire, and that somewhere along the line, Lilandra had come to blows with her brother Dekin, and then in turn like tried to flee the system. And then the result was that when it was established she was trying to come to Earth, that Erik the Red was alerted and said, hey look, capture her or kill the X-Men or do whatever you have to do, but get her and bring her back to the Shi'ar Empire, to our homeworld, so she can stand trial for her actions. And so what he basically does is he opens a Stargate. As soon as he opens this Stargate, he passes through with Lilandra and then it shuts. And Jean Grey, using all the powers of the Phoenix, channels all this cosmic energy into the Stargate, reopens it, and the X-Men pass through. And this leads directly into the X-Men essentially like arriving on the planet of the Shi'ar Empire. Now, when this happens, almost immediately, the X-Men begin coming to blows with the Imperial Guard. And the reason for this is because the Imperial Guard is the elite fighting force of the Shi'ar. That's really what they are. That when it comes to the Shi'ar Empire, they are essentially like an amalgamation of races. And so what this means is that when you have the Imperial Guard, it's literally an Imperial Guard. It's an elite fighting force composed of like some of the most capable races from across the entire section of the universe here in Marvel Comics. And so basically what ends up happening here is Lilandra finally spills the beans when there's a moment of reprieve between the X-Men and all the fighting that's going on. And what she basically says is that somewhere along the line, Dekin realized that there's an artifact out there called the M'Kraan Crystal. But the M'Kraan Crystal cannot just be traveled to and attained, right? You can't just jump into a ship, fly to the far side of the universe, take the M'Kraan Crystal out of its cradle and just be like, absolute power. It doesn't work that way. Instead, the M'Kraan Crystal is almost kind of in a sort of dimensional, little small dimension unto itself. And the way it works is that if the stars align correctly, a doorway opens once every million years. And when that happens, a person can pass through. The issue with this is that it's all just legend and hearsay. That the legend says if a person can basically can enter the M'Kraan Crystal and attain the power contained within, that basically they can go on to gain absolute power. Where Chris Claremont doesn't really explain it here, we can, because we kind of have the benefit of like all the stories that came after. And in a small little mini series, really a kind of a maxi series called Adventures of the X-Men, what Marvel did is they established the idea that the M'Kraan Crystal is essentially a hallway of doors. That when you enter the M'Kraan Crystal, that you can actually access other universes. But inside the M'Kraan Crystal is a city unto itself. Now the issue is that if the M'Kraan Crystal is pierced or in some way damaged or destroyed, it'll literally suck in the entire multiverse unto itself. And that's what happened in the Adventures of the X-Men. In the multiverse prior to this current one, that the M'Kraan Crystal was damaged by the Dweller in Darkness. And when that happened, it basically started sucking in the universe, the multiverse, the whole 9 yards, and then everything was recreated afterwards. And that's what's that's literally the legend or the story that Lilandra hits on, but doesn't actually specify, but that's what she's afraid of, that essentially like Dakin will either gain absolute power or he'll screw up and destroy the entire universe in the process. And so with this whole fight kind of going on between these two groups, that's when the Starjammers come into the equation. Now, the Starjammers are still ambiguous here, right? They've only been around for like a handful of issues, or something like 4 issues, and even then they only kind of appeared for a short time. So the basis behind the Starjammers, and particularly Corsair, has not been revealed yet. So those of you guys who do know the basis behind this, please do not spoil it in the comment section. But the Starjammers are really just space pirates. That's really it. But there is an actual history here between Corsair and the other members of the X-Men that like, again, we'll hit on at a later time. But basically what ends up happening here is it's kind of a repeat of what we saw much later on in the Adventures of the X-Men, when after the M'Kraan crystal was pierced in that particular story, the Phoenix tried to unite the minds of all beings in existence in order to basically stop this. The result was that the M'Kraan crystal couldn't be stopped. The destruction of the crystal and the end of the multiverse could not be prevented. But of course, Jean Grey doesn't know any of this, and so literally what she does with the M'Kraan crystal and everything, and literally like with this power kind of manifesting the way that it is, with him being snatched directly to its location in this little dimensional area, that what ends up happening is there's these kind of pulses that are sent out. And when these pulses get sent out for a fraction of a second, everything ceases to exist and then comes back. So imagine if Thanos like snapped his fingers and snapped again, and that's basically what happens, every single time a pulse is sent out by the M'Kraan crystal. Now the reason why this pulse is sent out is because 1, it's the M'Kraan crystal emanating itself, and 2, because this is basically the arrival of Joff. I always thought it was Joff. Okay, the way this works is that because the M'Kraan crystal contains such extreme power, that like a huge concern would be, what if somebody just walked up and took it and then just like ran amok in the universe? And so what ended up happening is there was basically a kind of security system put in place, that there was an agent, a protector of the M'Kraan crystal. And what ends up happening is that this guy Joff literally starts like crushing all of the X-Men, like just starts running through and essentially just like wrecking almost every last one of them. But Banshee is the one who figures it out. What Banshee realizes is that basically Joff made this statement about being programmed, that he was programmed for the purpose of protecting the M'Kraan crystal. If he's programmed, it means on some level he's a robot. And if he's a robot, he's got mechanical components. And so what Banshee ends up rationalizing here is that all he really has to do is just run up on Joff and then literally use his sonic scream to like disrupt all the mechanical components. And that's exactly what he does. He disrupts the mechanical components of Joff, which basically destroys him, and then they're met by Mott. And the way this works is kind of a cool revelation. The way this works is that there's Joff, who's the first guardian. Joff is the one who basically protects the M'Kraan crystal. If Joff is destroyed, then Mott will show up. And Mott's power is 1,000 times the power of Joff. If Mott's destroyed, then the next guardian will be 1,000 times the power of Mott, and it will keep going on. It's an infinite continuation of power until the individual who's there can be destroyed. Now, this is kind of the cool caveat to it, is that the design of this security system was to basically create kind of a dual riddle, kind of a riddle of sorts, is you face off against the guardians and they keep getting astronomically stronger, but they also get astronomically larger each time. The bigger they are, the easier they are to get around. And so they're really more of a distraction to distract you from the reality that you can actually just run up on the crystal because they're just so astronomically big. And that's exactly what happens, is the X-Men, Dakin, all these different guys basically end up running up on the crystal, literally entering the crystal itself. And when they do, it's like this infinite expanse of space that's also confining at the same time with a city on the inside. Now, this is essentially the White City, the city of like the White Phoenix of the Crown. Chris Claremont will not really establish this until we get into the Dark Phoenix Saga, but that's basically what this is. It's the city in the center of the M'Kraan crystal, that the Phoenix resides here. It basically exists here. That whenever the Phoenix is not manifesting itself in a different universe, whenever it's not doing anything and it's going back to its base of operation, so to speak, to rest, this is where the Phoenix Force goes, the center of the M'Kraan crystal. And so again, it's kind of a cool thing, because when this happens, like literally there's a kind of security system here. Again, another stage of effect here. And what ends up going on is that as they approach it, they're all basically met by like a nightmarish experience, that literally all they do is just see the worst of their nightmares. So again, it's designed to basically keep people at bay. Now, the issue with this is that Jean Grey as the Phoenix is really the only one who can actually walk up on the M'Kraan crystal and is not affected by like the force of the security systems, which again is really kind of Chris Claremont's way of saying like she's supposed to be here. And so when she goes through here and she starts analyzing the M'Kraan crystal and figuring out what's going on, what she basically starts doing is talking about like a lattice work and different things things like that. And for people who are reading through that, it can seem very confusing. So the easiest way to think about it is like this. The Imkron crystal has a huge source of energy, and basically it's like this small little neutron galaxy on the inside. Basically, like if the Imkron crystal were to be pierced, everything would be sucked in. What stops that from happening? Imagine like a chain link fence running around the Imkron crystal. So long as that fence is there and it contains the energy of the Imkron crystal, everything will be fine. The issue is that with the crystal being pierced, that chain link fence is now damaged, which means that power is leaking out. It's like having a pinhole leak in a wall with like a gazillion gallons of water behind it, right? Like with all that pressure, it's only a matter of time before it blows a hole in the wall. And that's basically what Jean Grey's realizing here. This lattice work is damaged, but because there's so much power confined behind this lattice work, even though it's like a small little tear, it's a small little piece of damage, it's only a matter of time before all this energy just explodes outward and then starts sucking everything in. And so what she ends up doing is kind of banning the spirits, essentially, of like all the X-Men together, and then using the power of the Phoenix to essentially go through and like repair this lattice work. And what it does is essentially fix the Imkron crystal. Now, this is why this is so important, because for somebody kind of looking at this and just sort of skimming through it, the reality is that it doesn't really seem like anything happens. The reason why is because the truth of the Phoenix Saga is that it's a prelude. The Phoenix Saga is a prelude to the Dark Phoenix Saga. The Phoenix Saga is basically designed to say, okay guys, so like Jean Grey's astronomically powerful now, but like what would happen if she became a bad guy? Like that's basically what it is. And like all the stories that take place between the Phoenix Saga and the Dark Phoenix Saga are designed to focus on that. They're designed to lead up to it. So like the Hellfire Club and all those different things, so on and so forth, it's all designed to lead into that. But this story is so significant because it was designed for the purpose of basically taking Jean Grey, who is one of the weakest characters of all time, and then throw her into becoming the most powerful member of the X-Men, and in fact, one of the most powerful beings in the entirety of the Marvel Universe. But it's a cool story. It's a cool little set of events. The result here is that after it's all said and done, Lilandra cannot return to the Shi'ar Empire, right? Like she's essentially exiled. She's banished. And so she's confined to Earth and ends up staying with the X-Men for quite some time. The Starjammers are also a part of the equation now, which means we'll also see some emphasis on the Starjammers as a focus on them and the role they play. But it's, again, kind of a prelude. So everything that comes after this leads directly into the Dark Phoenix Saga proper. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comments Explain, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.